When you hear people say that they don't want to see crime news, they don't want to see negative news, they want some happy stories, they want some positive stories, what do you think?
I think they're big fat liars, primarily.
That's John Archibald. He's my guest on this week's episode of Outlet Podcast.
If I write a story about crime, say, if that story gets an awful lot of hits in the first 10 minutes, the algorithm is going to say, hey, people like this story, so let's keep it prominently on display so they can see it all day long, because clearly we've struck gold with this one.
And you can tell already, he gets right to the point. He's a Pulitzer Prize-winning columnist in Alabama, and he's here in Massachusetts for the year because he received a Harvard Nieman Fellowship. His research question?
Does crime coverage in the digital age contribute to a culture of fear and to the political divide?
So this is a question that's really important to me as well. I've covered breaking news in cities across the country, covering crime, shootings, stabbings, all kind of crazy crimes that you would never normally imagine or encounter. I've covered them, and we've put them on the news as breaking news, with those big red graphics and bold lettering, dramatic music, all designed to get your attention and to keep it. And at the same time, we know that crime rates in the country are lower than they've been since the early 90s. And that's according to the FBI data and data from the Bureau of Justice Statistics. Those are the two main agencies that track crime in the US. So we know that crime, of course, is still happening in cities across the country, but overall, large-scale crime is way down. But you wouldn't know that by turning on the news in any given city as we're running these crime stories as breaking news over and over again. So what happens to a society that is inundated by this all the time? How do they view the communities around them and view people who are different than them? The president met with congressional leaders. Doctors will start implanting the devices. And you heard that warning from the Coast Guard tonight. For now, we're live in Orlando. For now, we're live in Dallas. We're live in Boston tonight. Caitlin McCulley, 7 News 19. I'm Caitlin McCulley. I left my job as a TV news reporter in a pandemic to try to find a better way to share stories that matter, no BS. Thanks for listening to Outlet Podcast. You can download new episodes each week. Here's John Archibald. Jump right in and tell me a little bit about what you're studying at Nieman.
Yeah, I've spent a lot of time in the last couple of years in the archives. I'm working on a book and a podcast, and I've got real interested in the way that crime was covered over the course of time. And you know how it is in the digital world where I live, where I guess most people live right now. It's really different than it was when I was covering police back in the day, because any crime story essentially you put on the internet, certainly where I come from in Birmingham, has a higher potential to go viral than anything else we do. And so coverage of crime gets millions and millions of hits, honestly, in a year. And it just strikes me that the more that happens, and the more we use algorithms to kind of keep those stories that are popular in front of people's eyes, then the more all our readers see is crime. And so, not all, of course, but I'm prone to hyperbole. But I had this question: does that affect us as a society and a culture, and does that help breed, an atmosphere of fear, and really sort of contribute to the political divide? And I'm still in the middle of my research, so I don't have a conclusive answer, but there is a lot of agreement that it's problematic.
Yeah, and I think there has been some research on the fact that people who view a lot of crime, whether that's through like Law and Order, CSI, or through news programming, they are more fearful. They become more fearful. It affects your outlook and how you perceive the community around you. So tell me how you're breaking this down as far as, is it just newspapers or TV as well? Or?
Newspapers. I mean, honestly, newspapers exist in the way newspapers existed more than any of the other mediums. So really the audience for newspapers are sort of different. I'm really concentrating on the digital because that's where a lot of these algorithms are employed. And in addition to those problems we talked about, I mean, one of the things is, I mean, for people who don't know how it works, I mean, if I write a story about crime, say, and it's put on our website, and our website is al.com, which is Alabama Media Group. If that story gets an awful lot of hits in the first 10 minutes, the algorithm is going to say, hey, people like this story, so let's keep it prominently on display so they can see it all day long, because clearly we've struck gold with this one. So this story that people are reading will stay up at the top of the site the way ours works, and the way many work in different media. And so that's what happens then. So the stories that are being seen get seen the most, which means they're going to be shared the most, which means that they're going to be seen even more. And so that's part of the problem. The other part of that problem is that there are algorithms that say, hey, that story 2 weeks ago did really well, so let's bring it back up and show it again. And sometimes what happened 2 weeks ago is not accurate 2 weeks later. For instance, charges may have been dropped against a person, or more facts might come to light. But regardless of that, this algorithm will push them back in front of people's eyes, who often, and readers often see those and have no idea, don't look at the date. They don't have any idea that it's essentially old news. So you're just getting a extra barrage of crime coverage, which contributes to your belief that particularly to the casual viewer, and let's face it, we're all, in a sense, casual viewers of the internet a lot of the time. So this constant wave of crime comes before you, and you say, regardless of the fact that crime over the last few decades has decreased a lot, you just come to believe that we are awash in crime, and hence the rhetoric of fear in politics that we often hear so often. It works. You make people afraid. You make them willing to do things they wouldn't do otherwise.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned coverage of crime stories when people are charged with crimes before they're convicted. I noticed one of the things that was different in Massachusetts when I moved up here in covering crime is that Massachusetts law protects people a lot better who aren't convicted yet, who haven't gone to trial. They don't release mugshots that often. They don't give you access to the same criminal data that, say, Florida or Alabama or Texas does. So I thought that was interesting. They at least make some effort to keep names and faces out of the public until and unless the people are convicted of a crime.
That would cause me a little consternation too, because I don't want to say these records aren't public, because I truly believe if somebody is arrested, then the people should be able to know who was arrested and for what. I mean, if they, and so, I mean, that's one thing. We as an institution where I work, have decided that we're not going to, publish mugshots, except in circumstances of very serious crimes, and there's a level of those things. And I'm not sure that's the answer either, but there's such prurient interest in them. I mean, there are lots of publications now that are simply simply mugshot magazines that they sell it.
You see them at gas stations and convenience stores, that kind of thing.
Like, see your friends. Look at this. Look at this idiot. So I mean, there's all that, but and so I wouldn't be one who would support saying you can't know why we're incarcerating someone or why someone is being held, because when you start holding people without telling people why, that's a pretty dangerous road to go down too.
Sure.
But the way it is so often covered in the digital media today, in my opinion, is socially irresponsible. And maybe because I'm old, and I came up as a cop reporter in the 80s and early 90s during what they called the crack wars then, when it was truly the crime rate was truly higher than it's been through most of the century. Through most of the 20th century. I told you I was old. And certainly up to now. I mean, there's been a recent uptick, but in those days it was really high. But, we had very strict standards about, number one, we had very large staffs who would go out and cover things and tell the stories of people of what happened and what witnesses saw and that sort of thing. And if it was of genuine community interest, we would put it in a prominent location. If it was not, it would go on page B4 in the crime briefs, and there would be a record of it. But that's quite a different scenario from throwing all of those things out there as if they were equal. And that's what happens on the web, is because there'll be one and another and another and another and another, and they all have pictures and they all have stories and they all have their own life. And it's very hard to determine sometimes what's a serious offense and what's not. So I think that in the very nature of the internet and the fact that many of us have much smaller staffs, and police reporters are much more reliant on police than they had to be when we had large staffs that would go out and find out information on a lot more of the cases than we can do now. I think that has a real big part to play in it. And you know, for one to be an effective news source, one has to be skeptical of authority. I mean, whether people like it or not. If you're not, then you might as well just be, you know, an arm of the state. And so I think that's one of the real problems.
When you hear people say that they don't want to see crime news, they don't want to see negative news, they want some happy stories, they want some positive stories, what do you think?
I think they're big fat liars, primarily because everybody says that. Everybody says they want big in-depth investigations and they want happy stories. That's what they tell you to your face. But you know, the hard truth now in this age of algorithms, in this age of page views, where I can tell you exactly how many, I hate to use the word clicks, but I'll say clicks, on any given story in my newsroom. I can tell you how many they got in the last 10 minutes, or how many they got in the last 24 hours, or any point in between, or what got the most page views in the last, since the start of the year. And which tells me that those people who tell me exactly what they want to my face are lying. Not that they're lying necessarily, but they may actually believe that's what they want. Mm-hmm. But their habits are that if a bizarre story about a crime, or a crime in their area, they're going to click on it to see if they know anybody's name, which is also a deceptive thing for media to believe that, and advertisers for that matter, to think that because this has so many page views, that people are, spending time with it, reading the stories. I mean, in a lot of cases, they're looking, fatal wreck. They look to see if they know the victim. Mm-hmm. Somebody shot.
Sorry, go ahead.
No.
I was just going to say, how detailed are the tracking mechanisms at a lot of media outlets' websites? Like, they can see the click. Can they see how long you spend on the article, where you stop reading, or where you click something else? Yeah,
there will be a time on site, a time on the story, a time, an average time for, if you were the reporter, we could click on you and it would tell us, how many page views you've got, how long mm-hmm. people spend on your stories, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And you can narrow that down to really what you want, all of that. Yeah. And, which is a great tool to know what people want. To know what people actually click on. It's a terrible tool if you're trying to do good journalism, because, I work for a local news organization, which has a duty in my, in my mind, and I'm not picking on us, I just work for us. Which, has a duty to cover the things that are of importance to that community. And say, for instance, I remember uncovering a big scandal at our local library board, right, where the head of the library board was doing something nefarious, and people were all up in arms. And it's never going to be a story that goes viral, because it's the Birmingham Library Board, right? I mean, there's a limited amount of interest. But among the people who are interested in that, it's a very intense interest. And so a very small, a few thousand people, for instance, might be seriously interested in that. but when we know exactly how many people are reading stories, everybody wants, or watching, or whatever it is your medium, everybody wants to be read or seen or heard. That's why we do what we do. We don't write so that nobody reads it. And so it doesn't take somebody sitting there saying, don't go cover the library board. It's not like that. It's just you intuitively know, how am I going to spend my time? Am I going to spend my time in a way that may have some importance to a few people? Or are we going to spend our time writing something that has a chance to be seen by huge numbers of people? And I think that's the real poison, is because that's not how news works on a local level.
Do you think people are aware that their habits on what they click on and what they spend time sharing reflect back to decisions that newsmakers and news managers make? Do you think people are aware that their actions online, that we're watching that, and if they say they don't want more crime, well, they're clicking on it, so we're giving it as a result.
I love that question. I love that question. It's really weird that I've never thought about it in those terms, exactly like that. I don't think that most people are aware. I mean, I'm sure most people aren't aware, based on the things that people say. There's a clear lack of understanding about that. But that also applies to people in the business. And I guess I have, over the course of time, developed a real sort of armor to that impulse to click on things that are clearly designed to get me to click on them. And nothing more. But it's hard, even being in the belly of the beast and knowing exactly how it works, and being sort of able to recognize a story that's just built for search engine optimization or for that impulse. And it's really hard to avoid the click. There's something psychological about it when it's done really well. It's like, it's like it's like putting candy by the cash register. It's not what you came to the store for. You never intended to buy the M&Ms, but they're staring you in the face, and all of a sudden you forget about the broccoli, and the M&Ms are in the basket. The broccoli maybe too, but maybe you got 2 bags of M&Ms. So. So I mean, I think that it's just one of those things that's not our priority. I mean, it's like pop culture, it's like anything. I mean, we there's a large number of people who share this interest. It may not be their primary interest. It may not be how they think they should run the country or view the world or live their lives, but they're involved in it in a way. And I think it skews the picture somewhat.
Do you think it's too much to ask of people to have that self-control? I mean, is it on us? Is it on people watching or reading?
I think it probably is too much to ask people to understand the inner workings of our business, and our business is to put news and information in front of people. It would be unfair to say, hey, we're going to put this out there and you have to decide whether it's important or not. I mean, that's what a lot of people do, essentially. They say, that's the democratization of news. Hey, that lets more people contribute and lets more people decide what's important, which all sounds great, but it's a bunch of crap. And in a lot of, in my view, I mean, I'm going to date myself again, but when I went through journalism school, the very, very first thing they taught was that that you are the gatekeepers.
Mm-hmm.
You're this concept that you are the one who keeps out the lies, who keeps out the insanity, the conspiracy theories, or you have to decide whether this is legitimate and has social value. And you have a very deep social responsibility to make sure that what you're putting out there is ethical and honest and fair and all of these great attributes. And we threw that away when the businesses started to go south, and the business model when the internet began, and when the internet, when the advertising models changed so drastically, thanks to so many factors. Um, so in desperation to try to move forward, which we had to do. I mean, I'm not saying it very clearly media had to adapt and change, um, and we did some things right and a lot of things wrong. But when we abdicate our sense of social responsibility, then we pretty much deserve the way people feel about us right now.
Mm-hmm. That's tough to digest, that we as journalists have some role in this, but we absolutely do. There's a lot of criticism of the media right now. Some of it deserved, I agree with you, and some of it not deserved. But there are a lot of times I feel that we're not doing ourselves any favors,
Right.
And you mentioned the diversification of media. People, we're not the gatekeepers per se anymore. How do we? This is, I guess, a big question. How do we evolve next so that we're not beholden to this model of advertisers and people watching, and we're giving people what they want because that's what will keep them picking up the newspaper or clicking online, or their eyes on the screen. I mean, how do we get out of this cycle?
Well, it's really hard, and nobody knows the answer. And as you say that, I start thinking of answers, and then I start thinking of the problems with those answers. And the fact of the matter is, the very definition of media is really difficult to come to, because it's not just traditional newspapers and radio and TV, and that you have talk radio as a media that that doesn't want to admit that it's part of the media. There's a gazillion points on the spectrum of websites and publications that it is on a whole spectrum of credibility, I would say. And it's hard, and just as it's hard to expect people to understand the workings of traditional media, it's hard for them to understand the workings of politically funded media, or ideologically driven media, or people in somebody's basement who are deciding that they should be writing about whatever it is they write about. So I mean, it's very difficult for people in one position on that spectrum to say, "Hey, I'm going to carry the torch for gatekeeping and for caution and for all these things, while everybody else is not doing that, and still survive." I would argue that those who wish to remain with their souls should do just that, though. I mean, you have to err on the side of caution. You have to invest in editors. You have to consider social responsibility before you consider the viral nature of the things you're putting out there.
Like you mentioned, the viral nature of crime stories in particular. How far do you think these stories travel from their point of origin?
A long way. And there are a number of websites on that spectrum that we talked about that specialize in that they which is great for our crime reporter, because it's 1 minute she posts and she works super hard, and the next minute it's been picked up by whoever it is, Drudge or whoever, and it's police news or whatever. It's international, and it's just through the roof. By far, the most pages anybody gets for us is our police reporter, Carol Robinson.
You're saying again exactly what you're.
Well,
in a sentence.
in a sentence, it's does crime coverage in the digital age contribute to a culture of fear and to the political divide?
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Hmm.
Do you think it does?
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. I'm reminded of a experience I had in covering news in Boston at my last station, in Roxbury, and there was a shooting, lots of shootings in that area over the years. We heard it over the police scanner. We get there, there's crime scene tape, all of that, and there was this. I think he was a high school kid who had come by to see what all the commotion was about. In our frenzy to get interviews, we're all kind of asking people if they saw anything, if they heard anything and if they knew anything about what happened. And this kid comes up and he's like, "Hey, why do you guys only come here when somebody gets shot?" And that is hard to answer as a reporter, because there's no good answer to that. The reasons are complicated and intertwined with the business model and with sensationalism and what people are watching and what will keep people watching. It's just it's so complex, but certainly doesn't make you feel good as a reporter. And he's right. Um, we didn't. I don't know that I've ever been back to that street.
Yeah,
So
I know that feeling.
you
And
know.
you're right. If you don't think about it, I mean, it's a real problem. If you do think about it, it's a different problem. And
Mm-hmm.
obviously, we both thought about it. But one of the flip side of that is, you know, I mentioned I think that I've been in the archives a lot, and I have, and I've been spending a lot of time looking at crime coverage of in Alabama from really the 30s through the 50s, 60s, and in looking at that, crime, we're seeing actually a lot of what I'm talking about today, in the sense that so much of what was, just a lot of it was just taken from police
Mm-hmm.
statements as fact, and put in the paper. But there were also huge numbers of homicides that were just not covered. Um, Almost all of them black people, black victims, particularly. And I was looking at police shootings of black people. So a lot of times, police shootings of black people in Birmingham just simply weren't covered, which is remarkable. Even then, um, because a lot of them were, and because of the staff sizes and the number of newspapers involved at that time, it couldn't have been an accident, And so, and we talked to a coroner about it, who was saying, this had to be, this has to be some kind of conspiracy, not to, not in this world to talk conspiracy about anything. Maybe that's the wrong word. Maybe they just didn't find it newsworthy. But I mean, if you don't cover the deaths of people,
Mm-hmm.
then you are also doing a disservice, and it's a failure to report the news. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, the fact of the matter is, when somebody dies in your community and you don't cover it, that's a problem. And
Mm-hmm.
you I'm also one who thinks that, when newspapers started charging for obituaries, it was the beginning of the end of newspapers, because if somebody dies in your community and you don't think it's news, then what does that tell your community?
Mm-hmm.
So, which is a different matter altogether.
Yeah. Yeah. So when you're looking at this big question of how all of this is intertwined, what is your strategy? You're going through historical archives.
Well, I mean, I'm trying to get a good sense of the data and the metrics and the number of, I'm not just looking at us. I'm looking at people who do it in different ways, and lots of different um, different news organizations do it in very, very different ways. I mean, if
Mm-hmm.
you look at the Post or the Times or whatever, you'll never see a crime story on the front page, because
Right.
they're so. I mean, in rare cases, because they're just curated in the old-fashioned way by editors who decide what's the most important story and put it on the site in that way. A lot of other digital first organizations, which are those who put it on the web first and then curate it for their news pages, um, don't do it that way. They throw everything out there at once and rely on those reader-based algorithms to determine the placement. And I'm really looking at those more than I am others. But I really want to look at all these various ways that the crime is reported,
Mm-hmm.
and to see which are the least harmful and the most beneficial. Because I mean, we do need to know where crime is being committed and by whom and against whom, and 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 how that affects our communities. It's an extremely important thing for people to know. But when we do it in a way that is unintentionally or intentionally or in any way misleading, then we are at fault.
And misleading could have multiple meanings, like misleading by lack of context, right? Like misleading by emphasizing the police side and not doing enough due diligence to get community reaction. Yeah, I think we're guilty of that in many forms. Often TV in particular is my experience.
I mean, I wouldn't say that. I mean, anymore. I mean, not that, I mean, we went through this whole, one of the big criticisms of TV back in the day, certainly anyway, was that if it bleeds, it leads kind of mentality, which which is exactly what we're talking about.
Exactly. Yeah.
And a lot of TV stations reassessed that, and some did and some didn't, and changed that sort of process. But what you're seeing on the digital on the digital platforms is essentially the same thing. If it bleeds, it's there, and people using these algorithms I talked about earlier decide what leads, and which is essentially an abdication of responsibility
on the part of journalists.
People would argue differently, but I think it's a cop-out.
So what's the solution?
I think things should be better curated. I think editors should decide what's important and order them accordingly to protect their own credibility and to help people determine what is important in the world. And I think one of the biggest problems we have in media today is that people cannot discern what they should consider important, because they are bombarded with things across a whole other spectrum, all of which compete for their attention with overwrought, search engine optimized headlines that don't accurately tell the story.
I wonder if people were more intentional about the information that they're consuming, being aware of the fact that they're being fed links to click on and things to share on social media, but do their research once, come up with a list of 4 or 5 outlets that they like and support and have various viewpoints, and are disciplined about what information they're consuming and what they're sharing. And in the same way that we go on social media diets, or we put our phones away for a while, it's all designed to keep our attention, to get our attention and keep it. And if people approached maybe news the same way that they approach getting lost in social media on Instagram or Twitter or something, if that would help. I don't know.
I mean, you're describing essentially what I do and what you probably do, both of us being very intimately familiar with news and having been part of it for a long time. Even so, I mean, if I see something, if somebody tweets a story that, I don't recognize the name of the producer or the organization, rather than click on that, I'm going to check with the sites I trust. I have learned to trust over the course of time, and I'm going to see if it is real. But at the same time, I mean, I don't know how reasonable it is to expect people to do that at this point. particularly
No.
when so much news is geared toward ideological, agreement rather than hard facts. But I tell kids when I talk to schools that, my generation's never going to do it. And the generation after me is not going to do it. But those kids came up with this and are savvy about the internet in ways you can't be if your early life was formed without it. And so I do believe they will be much more discerning about separating truth from, scam. But at the same time, the producers of problematic news are getting more and more savvy as well. So it's going to be a long fight.
What has surprised you, or if anything, in your research so far?
To be honest, it's really kind of confirmed what I thought my research has. I think what surprises me is the dozens of different, you can't really say the coverage of crime because it's done in so many different ways that there's no single, trend that everybody sort of abides by. And that's what's so interesting in this wild west of a news industry that we have. And I comfort myself by saying it's the wild west because eventually the wild west is tame.
Well, thank you, John. I appreciate it. It's good to talk with you. And good luck with the rest of your research.
Thanks. If I come across anything interesting, I'll let you know.